Leicester is one of the oldest settlements in Europe, but we can't really tell its story very successfully without archaeology. And it's quite surprising to realise that even sort of 80 to 100 years ago, we knew little more than the name of Roman Leicester, or at least part of the name of Roman Leicester, Ratae. We didn't get the suffix Coriel Tavorum right until quite recently. The jury wall, the upstanding piece of Roman masonry in the city centre, people still thought it might be the west gate of the Roman town. And it's only through excavations, particularly over the last sort of 80 odd years, that we've begun to understand how this story all fits together. Leicester's had a very strong antiquarian tradition going right back to the 17th century, and obviously the inhabitants of medieval and post-medieval Leicester were very well aware of the borough's early origins, and things like this mosaic pavement, the Cyparissus and the Stag pavement, was excavated in 1675, and it wound up eventually in the Jury Wall Museum. So things like that, discoveries of chance finds during building works, were quite common throughout the sort of 17th and 18th centuries. But there were no real sort of organised excavations until quite a bit later on. One of the first excavations was on the site of Leicester Abbey. No doubt there was certain ambition to find Cardinal Wolsey. But of course, it's very foolhardy to look for named individuals on excavations. But I think that was probably the impetus to start work at Leicester Abbey, because the site had completely disappeared following the dissolution of the monasteries. And there were some limited excavations, and this rather slightly disorganised looking excavation in the 1920s. The impetus for that one was probably the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, which was about a week before the excavation started. And so the local press very much said, well, here's Leicester's equivalent, we're going to find Tutankhamun's tomb. And so those excavations were probably not done to modern standards. There are sort of rudimentary plans, but there are no reports that exist of any of those sorts of sites. In more recent times, we've had excavations done to a very high standard indeed, starting with Dame Kathleen Kenyon's excavation of the Jury Wall site just before the war. Now, the City Council then had actually proposed to build a swimming baths on the site, and it was to their credit that they actually agreed to an excavation being undertaken, which ran for 3 seasons, with a large group of people, as you can see in the photograph, involved in the excavations. And also to their credit that it wasn't then built over subsequently, and it's been then displayed for all to see. More recently, the organisation of excavation in the city and archaeology in the city depends very heavily on a robust planning policy. Throughout the 50s and 60s, and probably into the 70s, a lot of archaeology was lost. It was the period of rescue archaeology. There was a small number of people, including Jean Meller, who ran the Leicestershire Archaeological Unit, who started work in the early 60s, who was basically outside digging almost all year round, trying to rescue sites from the Vaughan Way construction, from the underpass being built, from St Nicholas Circle being laid out, and the Holiday Inn being constructed. So often these were done with groups of volunteers with no payment made to them, and there was very little time to actually then write up the sites. But happily now, with the planning policy framework that was introduced in 1990, archaeology is a material consideration now in any development, and so lots of thought is given to whether we can protect the archaeology by redesigning buildings, or whether we then need to move to excavation to record the remains before they're destroyed. And so the city archaeologist in Leicester will monitor planning applications and discusses potential strategies with would-be developers. But as you can see in this illustration, this is one of the pile clusters from the new High Cross development, and there were lots of these, and of course that then means that most of the archaeology would be destroyed. So the High Cross site saw an unprecedented amount of excavation. It affected something like 12% of the historic core of Leicester, and Hammerson's were a sort of model developer in many respects. So they funded the archaeology to the tune of nearly £4 million, and we did 3 very, very large sites, and we're now moving towards publication of the results. So we're very grateful indeed to Hammerson's for that, and also to the city for having such a good, robust planning policy. Now, I'm going to be talking about quite a few excavations this evening. It's quite a large subject to cover in an hour, and it's also worth mentioning that there are sort of whole armies of archaeologists who've been involved over the decades. This is just one photograph of the group that did the Inland Revenue Building, Leicester 1 on Causeway Lane. At the height of the High Cross development, there was something like 60 archaeologists working in Leicester, and a lot of other neighbouring counties complained that we'd cornered the market in archaeologists, so there weren't enough around to do all the other work. Now, what I'd like to do is to do initially a sort of thumbnail sketch really of each period of archaeology to give you a sort of feel of how we've learnt how the town develops over time. So, for example, in the Roman period, the archaeology can tell us a lot about the architecture of the town, its infrastructure, and we can learn also about diet, health and living conditions from a study of artefacts and eco-facts, from environmental analysis in particular. In more recent years, we've had a very strong policy of sampling things like cesspits and wells, and the environmentalists like nothing more than getting their teeth into a good cesspit to sieve the remains and recover things like mineralised seeds and plant remains so they can build up an idea of sort of diet. We can also learn a lot about the architecture of the town as well, although in Leicester it's worth mentioning that because there's not a very good source of building stone in the vicinity, there's constant recycling, and so in the development boom of the 12th century, for example, when a lot of the churches were constructed, the abbey was constructed, the Roman town was a very convenient quarry, so almost always walls have been robbed of their stone, and they're what we call robber trenches. So we find the lines of walls and we find sometimes floors, but more often than not the archaeology is quite badly damaged. Now, this is a plan of Roman Leicester, which I'll explain how it develops. That's the clock tower, in case anybody doesn't know whereabouts they are. So that's the centre point here is more or less where the underpass goes through and where the car park is at the top of the high street, and then that's the Jury Wall Baths. Now, the earliest settlement that we have in Leicester dates to the 1st century BC, so it's a late Iron Age settlement. Elsewhere in the city, in the modern suburbs at Beaumont Leys and Humberston, we have earlier Iron Age settlements with roundhouses and boundaries and pits and wells and things like that. But they seem to sort of fizzle out towards the end of the Iron Age, and we then see this very high status settlement developing on the east bank of the Soar, behind the Jury Wall Museum and what's now Bath Lane. And so we have fragments of roundhouses, we have evidence of trade with the continent, with Spain and Italy in particular, with imported high status pottery and so forth coming in. Roman settlement then starts probably in the 50s. Britain's obviously been conquered by Claudius in 43 AD, and probably by 50 they're in Leicester, and we start to see things like timber buildings being constructed, which of course leave no trace in the archaeological record in terms of physical timber. It all rots away, and we find things called beam slots where beams were laid in the ground and then posts were tenoned into them. So we see settlement in that sort of area shown on the plan of timber buildings on all sorts of different alignments. And we also have evidence for a small fort on what's now West Bridge, represented by a very short stretch of ditch of a sort of typical military type with a sort of cleaning channel in the bottom. Towards the end of the 1st century AD, we then see the town being formalised as a civitas capital. That's the capital of a tribal territory, in this case the Coriol Torvi, who are a sort of one tribe which consists of a loose confederation of smaller tribal groups probably. And we see the establishment of the main infrastructure of the town, the regular pattern of streets, initially laid out with ditches, no metalling to start with, and then as the town becomes developed, streets become developed. So it's rather like a sort of, in many ways, like a modern housing development in that sense. By the sort of early to mid-2nd century, almost the whole of the historic core of Leicester has been developed with timber buildings, now all aligned on the street grid. And so it spreads well beyond the line of the later town defences. In the middle of the 2nd century, we start to see civic buildings being constructed. So, for example, Right in the middle, the forum, the sort of market centre, and then the basilica on the north side of it for the administration of justice is built in the sort of 150s and 60s. It's a huge building, which we'll come back to in a minute. Next to it, the baths complex is constructed about the same sort of time. We then see in the 2nd century the development of townhouses, some quite high status ones, including one that was excavated by John Wacher, the former professor of archaeology here at Leicester, back in the 1950s. So the Blue Ball Lane townhouse was excavated by him, and also the McKellum that lies on top of it, which I'll come back to in a minute. Also in the 2nd century, towards the end of the century, we see the establishment of town defences, initially an earthen rampart with one or more ditches in front of it and a timber palisade and probably timber gates. And what the effect of that is to render a number of buildings extramural. So it slices right through the pre-existing settlement, and that you then start to see the build-up of suburbs as well outside that. So this plan shows the line of the town wall, and we do now have a west wall, which for many years was missing, but has now been picked up in excavations in the Bath Lane area. The McKellum is a market hall that's added probably in the 3rd century, which we'll come back to again. Then we also see surrounding the town a number of cemeteries. So we see cremation cemeteries and then inhumation cemeteries going right through to the 4th century. And so regularly we excavate sites on, for example, Newark Street, where there are lead coffins and probably Christian burials as well. So really towards the end of the 3rd century, most of Roman Leicester is quite heavily built up with these quite monumental public buildings constructed using charnwood stone in their foundations and local Danehill sandstone in the superstructure with tiled roofs or Swidland slate roofs, whereas there are lots of other buildings that are probably constructed of timber framing and daub. So this is a view looking from the sort of north side. It's a view done by Mike Codd, just to give you an impression of what the sort of town looks like at that stage. Now, in terms of early development of Leicester, on the Bath Lane area, we did a site called the Merlin Works site, where the new glass towers were going to be constructed, and found an amazing structure here, which is very like the Jury Wall Baths, this monumental square building with apses, semicircular apses, one here with a hypocaust in it, and which looks very like the Jury Wall Bath site. So we'll come back and see whether this is perhaps another bath block or whether it's one that was abandoned because of its position very close to the river. But the main point of mentioning this site is that this is where we're seeing now some very early activity, Iron Age ditches running underneath here, and we're also seeing some quite special finds coming up, like, for example, these coin moulds with traces of gold residue inside them. So this is for casting flans for striking coins. So very similar coins to the ones found in the East Leicestershire hoard. And we're also seeing some very high status imports of pottery, as shown at the bottom here, from Gaul and from Italy. So it's a very high status settlement. What we don't yet know is how that then relates to the earliest Roman occupation. We're also seeing pits underneath the Jury Wall site, very early pits from the middle of the 1st century, again containing all of these high status wares. Now, the Jury Wall site, I'm going to mention quite briefly because most people will know it quite well. This is the one excavated by Kenyon in 1936-9, and a lot of the site was quite heavily robbed, but enough survived to be able to sort of reconstruct the outline of the principal rooms. And it's also worth mentioning that the survival of the Jury Wall itself is very unusual, that it's not been demolished and robbed, and that's probably because it was incorporated into St Nicholas's Church in the middle or late Anglo-Saxon period, and that's one reason why it's still there. Now, the Jury Wall site is quite a large complex of buildings, and the Jury Wall itself is the division between the exercise hall, the palæstra, and the baths themselves. So this illustration hopefully gives you a better idea of which bit's the Jury Wall, which is just here, with these two archways leading from this basilican building into the changing rooms of the baths, and then you could proceed into the warm rooms and the hot rooms and have cold plunge baths and so forth. And so this bathing complex was used obviously for the obvious purpose, but also to meet people, to conduct business and so forth. And it seems to be remained in reasonable repair right through the Roman period into the 4th century. The other monumental building is the Forum. This one wasn't excavated in its entirety because it's so massive. It's 130 metres by 90 metres, and it runs under the Vaughan Way. And unfortunately, in the 60s, the underpass cut right through the Western Range. So most of this range disappeared when the underpass went through. But having said that, most of the walls are robbed of their stone, but the columns and things do survive. So effectively, this is a building with a colonnade and then shops surrounding the sort of square in the middle, and they're probably sort of lock-up shops let to individual traders, and then the basilica at the northern end is for the administration of justice and the administration of the tribal territory. This plan is really just to illustrate how it's a bit of a join the dots exercise because of this massive building. You can see the actual excavations are quite limited really in terms of their scope. So a lot of it is supposition, and there is still quite a bit left to go at in the future, particularly on the sort of eastern and northern sides. Now the Forum also was maintained right through the Roman period. We see lots of reflooring episodes. There are a number of examples of fire damage from it, but it's such a massive building, I suspect that it doesn't mean that the whole lot was burnt to the ground, and that it's just very sort of localised damage. Now, this is an aerial shot of Leicester looking probably from the western side. Sort of southwest is down here. You can see the cathedral in the middle, and that shows the outline of the town defences. The orange bit is the outline of the High Cross Leicester development. So you can see it's quite a large proportion of the historic core of the town. Now, although High Cross is a massive development, we also deal with lots of smaller developments, and we get sort of very small scraps of archaeology that can then actually tell us quite significant things. The site down here on Castle Street was developed for student accommodation, and it revealed what people have been calling a delicatessen. Very small scraps of archaeology, but this is the main road coming into Leicester from the south, running past where De Montfort University now is. So through the south gate towards the Forum, and we're seeing evidence for a colonnade with these granite foundations for columns. The building's mostly gone, but what's really significant here is that there's a cesspit which contains a particularly interesting assemblage of remains. So we're getting, for example, these shoulder blades from cattle with perforations in them as if they were hung up to be smoked. We're seeing various fish bones and scales coming up, and then more exotic imports like dried fruit, figs and grapes, and then seasonings like opium poppy. We think it's a delicatessen rather than a tavern because in the pottery assemblage there was no real evidence of any sort of drinking vessels. So we think people were probably just going there to buy food in an area very close to the Forum. So Mike Codd's done a reconstruction just showing what he thinks it's like. It's not a shop I'd care to go into if it had a proprietor wielding that very large knife on the left-hand side. But this is really how the sort of story of Leicester's improved over the last sort of 2 decades with the advent of environmental archaeology. Now, moving on to the High Cross area, for the first time with High Cross, we've started to be able to see complete plans of buildings, which is very unusual in a town like Leicester. And one of the main ones is the Vine Street townhouse, which you can see looking towards the top of the picture. This is now the site of the John Lewis store. That's Vaughan Way running through the middle. That's the Inland Revenue building. And so just here is the outline of the Vine Street townhouse, sort of fully excavated by this stage, showing the lines of the robber trenches. Now this building is unusually, we're seeing an entire building about 40 metres square, together with adjacent properties as well. And it's a building which developed over quite a long period of time. It's quite difficult to work out the phases because all of the walls are robbed. There's the occasional well-preserved bit of archaeology from down in this area, where we're seeing a hypocaust. That's an underfloor heating system consisting of a series of piles of tiles called pili, which would have supported a floor, and then next to it is evidence for a plunge pool as well. And this only really survived fortuitously because in antiquity they demolished the building and just simply backfilled the hypocaust, which is why it's remained. You can also see more modern destruction here. There's a pile just here from a 1970s building which took out that part of the hypocaust but missed the rest of it. So the townhouse really evolves initially from a series of timber buildings in the sort of late 1st century, early 2nd century, where we've got evidence from environmental samples that they were breeding pigs in the vicinity. There's the remains of an ox goad that was found, so they were leading oxen. So it's very much a sort of an agricultural type institution. It then sort of changes rather into the 2nd century when we see a more formal house being constructed with masonry foundations, slate roofs, veranda, also an adjacent bathhouse, one we've just looked at, the hypocaust there. So it's becoming more of a sort of residential establishment, but possibly with an element of sort of gardening in the vicinity, plus other adjacent properties as well. And then into the early 3rd century, this building suddenly develops into a real Mediterranean-style townhouse. What were workshops in this sort of area now become the kitchen of the townhouse. We see a major range constructed over here with an apsidal room, a veranda looking into the courtyard, mosaic pavements. We see a new bath block constructed, possibly, with a hypocaust, a stoke pit just there, with streets laid out, and then an adjacent building, which is a difficult one to interpret, but it has walls that are over 1 metre thick, so we think it could be something like a warehouse, something like that. So this is a sort of an imaginative reconstruction of how the townhouse might have looked at its height. So you can see, here we have the apse, which is possibly the dining room or triclinium, just here with a view looking out through the courtyard. The main entrance would probably be here, so people would come in and see the sort of grandeur of the building as they came to greet the owner. And then we have a series of well-appointed rooms on this side with mosaic pavements, and then on this side it's more the sort of service ranges with the kitchen and so forth. And amazing, there is one scrap of pavement in the museum collection found in the 1850s, which we can pretty well identify as coming from that room down there. We also found another of other bits of pavement during our excavations, but heavily disturbed, including one from the sort of peristyle corridor here, looking out into the courtyard, a little fragment of checkerboard pavement, probably from the early 4th century. Now, what's quite interesting about this building, actually I'll just flick back one, is this range here with the apsidal room and these other heated rooms with hypocausts is remarkably similar to another site that we excavated back in the 80s, a suburban villa called Norfolk Street, which is up on the Hinckley Road. And this has a range which is almost identical to Vine Street with the same apse, the same sized rooms and the same corridor as well. Plus we're finding evidence from the painted wall plaster. This is a fragment of wall plaster with keying impressions on the back, and they match precisely with the ones from Vine Street, which suggests that the same builder is doing both buildings, which is quite something. But who lived at Vine Street is the big question, and we assume it's quite a wealthy family, and one clue is this piece of an Egyptian ivory box with Anubis carved on it, which almost certainly comes from North Africa. Plus we have a series of lead seals from the 6th, the 20th, and the 3rd and the 6th Legion as well. The one down here has the 3rd on one side and the 6th on the other. And these are sort of seals which would have been affixed to documents or consignments of goods. So one idea is that the owner is actually either a retired military person or is indeed actually a military person who's receiving these documents. The townhouse is fairly short-lived in that after about 80 or so years in the early 4th century, it seems to be demolished, and the palatial west range and north range have gone. And we find some quite interesting things hidden away in these two demolished ranges here, including 2 curse tablets, a hoard and a large lead ingot. Now, first of all, there's a coin hoard, which has over 500 coins dated to the 330s, and they seem to have been disturbed in antiquity, so we wonder whether perhaps they were buried with more valuable items and somebody came to collect the valuable items but threw away all of these coins, which by then were so deflated in value they weren't worth bothering to recover. And then we see things like the lead ingot here, which may not look very big, but it takes 4 people to lift it. Now, the curses are perhaps the most significant find from this site altogether. There were 2 rather unprepossessing looking things. They're only about this sort of length. And somebody spotted that they had Roman cursive writing on them. And Roger Tomlin of the University of Oxford managed to decipher them. And you can see on the left-hand side, this one has a block of text at the top, and then what looks like a list down the left-hand side. And that is indeed what it is. It's a curse from Servandus, who asks his favoured god Maglus to basically kill whoever stole his cloak. And then there's a list of all of these names from sort of Gaulish names and Celtic names, that sort of thing. And there's also a reference to a paedagogium, which may mean a training establishment for slave boys. So it may be that this curse actually refers to the slave population of this particular household, because curses are thought to be associated mainly with the lower levels of society rather than high status people. The second curse, a bit less well preserved, and this one refers to Sabianus, who's had his silver coins stolen. And the major significance of this one is there's a reference to a building in Leicester, which we never heard of before, called the Septisonium, which there I think are only a couple of examples in the whole of the Roman Empire, and these are thought to be shrines to the 7 celestial deities, i.e. the Roman days of the week. And interestingly, I was looking at a stone report for the nearby Blue Boar Lane townhouse that was excavated in the 50s, and that revealed evidence for a stone column which is thought to have been associated with it's called a Jupiter column, and it may have been associated with a shrine to the 7 celestial deities. So that site is only about 5 minutes walk from the Vine Street townhouse, so that's quite a nice connection. Now, moving on to the later Roman period, it starts to get quite interesting when we think about what happens to Leicester after the withdrawal of the Roman administration and the withdrawal of the legions in 410 AD. And it's very elusive archaeology in that it's the sort of upper levels of the Roman period, and they're often damaged by later development. So this site on High Cross Street, next to the Free Grammar School, provides some really important evidence of the end of Roman Leicester. Opposite this site, under where the Travelodge is now, was the Roman Macellum or market hall that was built in the 3rd century. And incidentally, later, just here, was the Blue Boar Inn, where Richard III spent the night before, shortly before Bosworth, which we'll come back to in a little while. Now, the street running along the front of this site runs north-south, runs through here. This is one of the principal streets of Roman Leicester, so the Macellum will be on this side. There's a boundary wall, and what we're seeing in the 4th century, a load of pits cutting into the edge of the street, suggesting that civic order has broken down and that people are being allowed to sort of damage the street. But then more importantly, we then start to see dark earths building up over the street, which contain evidence of burnt daub and animal dung and things, suggesting that there's a slightly different type of occupation. And then what happens next is that we then see a wall that's collapsed over it. Now, this wall is a unique discovery for Roman Britain. There are collapsed walls from other smaller buildings, but this seems to be the collapsed wall of a major public building, and it's the gable end wall of the Macellum, which would have stood at least 16 metres high, and it seems to have fallen at some point in the 5th century. Unfortunately, there isn't a person underneath wearing Saxon armour like that to help us get an idea of the dating. But what's really important about it is you can see that we've got evidence for what the superstructure of the building looked like with these sort of tile courses and an archway. And that shows how it relates to the Macellum. Here's the basilican building, and then here's the collapsed wall that's come off this sort of gable end. And then cutting into the top of it is this very small structure called a sunken feature building, rather boringly by archaeologists, a little two-post hut type feature, which seems to be typical of the early Anglo-Saxon period. So the legions are withdrawn, we don't know what's happening in terms of the population of the Romano-British population, but then we start to see different types of building coming in for the first time. And this, we think, is then an Anglo-Saxon structure that's 5th or 6th century, cutting into the collapsed wall, here it is, and then with the ruins of the McKellum behind it. Now, elsewhere in the town, until very recently, we had no knowledge at all of what happened in the Anglo-Saxon period. But some small scatters of handmade pottery started to appear in the northeast quarter of Leicester, and other finds, including things like this, a bone comb came up from the Shire's excavations in the late 80s. And these are typically associated with weaving and thought to be, again, 5th, 6th century. Then also these classic Anglo-Saxon brooches as well. So clearly there was something going on within the ruins of the Roman town in that period. Confusingly, we also did some excavations outside the town, south of De Montfort University on what's now Oxford Street, and found the remains of another bone comb and other objects associated with textile manufacture, these spindle wools, and what's called a pin beater for beating down the weft on a loom, plus the remains of another building here, represented by these post holes where timber posts used to be. So clearly there are two areas of settlement in the early Anglo-Saxon period, sort of one within the Roman walls and one outside, but as yet we can't refine the dating sufficiently to know whether one succeeds the other. Now, rapidly moving on to medieval Leicester, 1500 years is a lot to cover in an hour, so I'm afraid I'm going fairly quickly. Now, in the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, that's in the sort of 7th and 8th century, archaeology is completely silent at the moment. We don't know whether it means that they're not here or whether they're not using artifacts that survive. If they're using wooden bowls and wooden spoons and things, they would all disappear. But what we do know is that Leicester has a bishop in the 7th century, and one idea is that it's actually the Church of St Nicholas next to the Jury Wall. And it may be that there are periodic fairs and markets. But then the bishop, there are several bishops in succession, but then with the onset of the Viking invasions, it's thought that the final bishops fled south to Dorchester in the 9th century. And then in the 10th century, Lady Ethelfleda retakes Leicester. And we start to see some evidence of activity in the very late 10th century. So one theory was that these are still the lines of the Roman walls, effectively. One theory was that you were getting the development of reoccupation along this principal street, which is now High Cross Street and Southgates. And there are a few finds coming from along there which would seem to bear this out. So we're getting sort of 10th century Viking-style finds coming from up there. And we're also now beginning to see timber buildings coming up, fragments of timber buildings with 10th century pottery from the sites that we dug for the High Cross. And we also have evidence for a pottery kiln also the same sort of period. So perhaps by the time of the Norman conquest, we've already got a fairly flourishing town. Certainly by Doomsday, there ought to be 320 houses, 6 churches, and a fairly healthy population. So it's probably spreading from this area along the middle of the town and gradually spreading out into that area just there in the northeast quarter where the High Cross development is. At the time of the conquest, the castle is established on the southwest angle of the Roman town defences, a Motte and Bailey castle, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then within the walls, the street pattern develops over time. We don't have much evidence yet for the dating of the different elements. And we see the establishment of a number of religious houses in the 13th century, such as the friaries, the Grey Friars, of course, the Black Friars up here, then the Austin Friars, which may have succeeded another friary called the Friars of the Sack. And then we see the establishment of Leicester Abbey beyond the town to the northeast, traditionally in 1143. Within the walls also there are things like the common bread ovens, sort of in this sort of area, because the Lord has control of the baking rites. And then we have things like the Wednesday market at the junction of High Cross Street and High Street, and the Saturday market down here. So quite a lot of the internal area is taken up with religious precincts and markets. The walls of Leicester seem to be maintained throughout the medieval period, certainly until the sort of 14th century, then they start to go into decline. And their main function by then seems to be to make sure that the borough officials can collect tolls at the entry points into the town, because obviously the borough has to control its market rights very carefully, and it enrolls people into the merchant guild who become freemen of the borough, who then don't have to pay dues. Now what I'm going to do is, having just very briefly gone through medieval Leicester, I want to then just look at a number of sites just to give you an idea of how we've made progress on some of the more significant buildings in the town, some of the high status buildings, and also learnt more about lower status activity. And I think it's true to say that medieval archaeology was very much the poor relation of Roman archaeology until quite recently, and it was quite common for the medieval levels to be bulldozed off to get to the proper stuff in the past, but happily that's not now the case. So here's medieval Leicester by about 1450. This is Mike Codd's reconstruction looking from the northeast, and the town has boomed in the 12th century, and that's when all the robbing of the Roman walls occurs. But then after about 1300 we see a major decline in one of the areas, in what's now the High Cross district, and it seems to be largely depopulated by the end of the 14th century, and two of the churches in the area are gone by about 1500. So we do see a bit of a decline, and it's not quite on the scale of other neighbouring medieval towns like Nottingham and Coventry and Stamford. It's much smaller, and almost what we would see as a village nowadays in terms of population. So first the castle and high status buildings. The castle is only really, the layout of the castle is only known through archaeology, and the early castle is a Motte and Bailey type, thought to have been founded by William the Conqueror on one of his first northern campaigns, and it was allocated to his right-hand man at Hastings, Hugh de Grandmesnil, the first Lord of Leicester. And this plan shows how small excavations have revealed the outline of the Bailey ditch and the ditch surrounding the motte. So it's fairly slender evidence, and the castle develops over time from this timber structure in the 11th century. Then in the 12th century you see the first Earl of Leicester, Robert de Beaumont, probably building stone defences, a stone curtain wall, and possibly even a shell keep on the motte as well. The Great Hall itself, which we'll come to in a minute, is credited to the second Earl of Leicester, Robert le Bossu, and it's about 1150. Then his son Robert Blanchemain rebels against Henry II, and Henry II then orders the demolition of the town defences and the castle defences, and sums of money are recorded for that. Now, as archaeologists, we rather sort of scoffed at previous people's identification of deposits of stone in this ditch as being evidence of this destruction of the castle defences. More recently, on excavations of the town walls nearby, on Westbridge Wharf near Westbridge, we have actually now found evidence of a big chunk of town wall that looks like it had been undermined in the medieval period. So it may well be that he did indeed slight the castle defences and the town defences in that period. Now, moving on to the sort of, in a way, the jewel in the crown of the castle is the Great Hall. And it became a bit of a mission of mine back in the 1980s to try and learn a lot more about it. I'd seen various references to the fact that it might be as early as 1150, and bits of it did survive. So when the County Council were dealing with serious dry rot and death watch beetle in the mid-80s, we took the opportunity to arrange to have access on the scaffolding to do a full drawn record of the timbers of the roof, and also tree ring dating as well. There's a nice illustration that only came to light about 2 years ago by Henry Goddard and held by the Goddard family of Newton Harcourt, and that shows the appearance of the Great Hall in 1821 before it was savaged by major alterations. And that shows it to be an aisled building with timber, these oak posts with scallop decoration. So it's divided into a nave and two aisles by these posts. And the big question really was whether the roof that's shown in this engraving is actually the roof that's contemporary with the original construction, or whether it's a later addition. So tree ring dating of these timbers certainly revealed that they were 1150. This is one of the capitals that's still in the hall, and here's one of the columns that still survives embedded in one of the walls. And so the dating of these is about 1150, allowing a certain amount of sapwood allowance. And there were trees that were growing in the sort of 9th century, probably in the Earl of Leicester's forests. And that's enabled us to reconstruct the nature of the original timber frame, because we now know that the upper roof dates to the 16th century, the very early 16th century. And so the Great Hall is effectively what's known as a clear-storied building. So it has a roof above the nave, supported by these timber posts, and probably with semicircular arches, again in timber, probably with sort of chevron decoration on them, so very typically Romanesque. It's based largely on parallels with the Bishop's Palace at Hereford, but also other elements of this building are based on further investigations we've done. So one of our staff, actually much smaller than me, went down a central heating flue and found the base of one of these columns and evidence for joints on the base of a column, which enabled us then to reconstruct the dais or raised platform where Robert the Bossu would have sat, looking down the building towards the service end down here, which would then led to the sort of buttery, pantry and kitchen. So that's an imaginative reconstruction of the interior of the Great Hall in the 12th century. And you can see here on this slide, this is the area to the south of it, which were the kitchens of the Great Hall, and beneath them what's known as John of Gaunt's cellar, which again we've done further architectural survey of. It's not really a cellar, and it's not really anything to do with John of Gaunt. It's more of a sort of storeroom beneath the kitchen block, and it seems to be contemporary with the Great Hall, so 1150-ish, but then it has major alterations in about 1400, when it's gentrified with the addition of polygonal towers and so forth. These are mason's marks that are on the stones of the vault. Now, I'm going to have to rattle on fairly quickly now. Another high status building is 9 St Nicholas Place, underneath the BBC building on St Nicholas Place, Guildhall Lane corner. And so this is a building that was first discovered in the 1860s and seems to be the undercroft to a wealthy merchant's house. And so that still survives now underneath the BBC building. You can just about see through some glass panels in the floor. So that's quite a rare survival for Leicester. Other high status buildings, such as inns, we haven't really had much chance to investigate. But another discovery recently is this little notebook that's in the hands of the Goddard family again, which, while I was seeing that engraving, discovered that they also had this little notebook. And while flicking through it, I realised that there were drawings of the Blue Boar Inn in minute detail. The building was demolished in probably about 1830, 1835, and the Goddards, Henry Goddard, drew these drawings showing all of the jointing with all of the measurements and everything, and it was immediately recognisable as the Blue Boar Inn from the nature of the frame. And that's now enabled the production of a three-dimensional drawing of the timber frame, which is capable of being exploded to show all the jointing and everything. So this has been done by a local architect, Stephen Davis. But the great thing about it is that the information is such that if you wanted to, if you had the money, you could build a new Blue Boar Inn based on this information. So. Right, moving on to more mundane sites, slightly more mundane sites. This is again the High Cross Street excavation. And this is a more typical medieval site in Leicester with narrow properties called burgage plots, usually a building at the front, and then as you go down the plot they have things like privies and wells and cesspits. They'll be keeping animals in them and so forth. And this one, I mean, the pits produce lots of good evidence for the foods that were being consumed in medieval Leicester. And we're seeing, yes, some exotic things coming in, more grape pips, lentils, other fruit stones. We also see evidence of industry. Some of the bones exhibit, for example, there are fletchers working on one of the sites in Leicester where we're seeing goose quills discarded in a pit. We also see evidence of bones discarded associated with hide processing, so the sort of tanners and the whittoyers and the fellmongers. We also see things like this, which is a bit of chain mail which came from one of the pits, which is thought possibly to be a sort of triangular piece of chain mail worn by a high status knight. But this site's also very notable for evidence of a medieval brewery. And breweries are obviously very important in the medieval period because most people are drinking ale because the water is not safe to drink. And this site, this is the street frontage up here, what's now High Cross Street, and it revealed a series of industrial features in one of the areas of the backyard with a dividing wall running down the middle here. One of the most unusual features is this thing, which is thought to be a malting oven. It's a conical shaped structure with a flue leading into it, and it's thought that you would lay wood across it and then a layer of horsehair matting, and then you'd spread germinated grains, which is malt, on the top to sort of roast it lightly. So that's the first stage really in the sort of manufacture, the production of ale. And we also see other things like hearth bases. There's a hearth base here, a sort of granite base, which is scorched and which is probably the base of a vat, like a metal vat like this one, used for sort of heating up the mash for the brew. And so this is Mike Codd's reconstruction of the brewery, showing the process going on, the malting down here, the mash being heated in these areas, and then the sort of fermenting vats as well. So what's quite interesting about this brewery is it's actually very close to the Wednesday market at the junction of High Cross Street and the present High Street. So it's clearly supplying, particularly on market days, it's probably supplying enormous quantities of drink. Other sites in Leicester are perhaps not quite so well preserved when we're dealing mainly with pit evidence. So moving up to the north, this is under the John Lewis car park, and it's where the Vine Street townhouse was. And when we get into the 12th century, most of the Roman buildings have gone by then. They've disappeared, been robbed away, the stone's all gone. And we see lots of clusters of medieval pits. So lots of cesspits and wells in here, usually forming sort of lines as if there are definite property boundaries, but maybe not divided by stone walls, but perhaps by mud walls that don't leave any trace in the archaeological record. The other thing about this site is it is the site of one of Leicester's lost churches, St Michael's, which is gone by 1450. And this seems to have been quite a small building in this area up here, with a graveyard with about sort of 500 burials in it, which are all excavated as part of the project, and surrounding the remains of the Roman stone warehouse that we saw previously. So that's a sort of reconstruction of St Michael's. The other big medieval church site we excavated was that of St Peter's Church, underneath the present John Lewis building, which now runs right across here. This church had been demolished in the 16th century and the materials were used to build the free grammar school. It's notable really for the masses of burials that were excavated, something like 1,350. So here's the church, completely robbed of its stone. Here are all the burials surrounding the church, and then next to it was a high status hall with undercroft that was then replaced by a sort of mud building just here. So the St Peter's, had some very interesting groups of burials which tell us a lot about the sort of health of the population and the sort of size of people, the age at death, and various sort of diseases like tuberculosis and syphilis and arthritis, bad teeth and so forth. So these are the sort of poor end of the population of medieval Leicester. We also see evidence, for example here, of a 12th century group of burials, about 20 odd burials that were probably victims of an epidemic. And then at the bottom right, a charnel house within the church which contained the remains of about 80 odd individuals that were all sort of piled up. The graveyard expanded many times, and this slide just illustrates how burials lie on top of earlier pits which have organic material in them which then subside, and all the burials subside into the pits, so you get a good sequence going. So that's the outline of the church, the main parts of the building, all robbed away, and you can see the graves under excavation. The church evolves over quite a long period of time, and we only really know its dating from radiocarbon analysis of burials. So we do now know that it's a late Saxon structure, probably very early 10th century from the dating of this charcoal burial. And it then gets enlarged with a bell turret, a new chancel, aisles, an even bigger chancel, a vestry, and then the charnel house. So it's quite a sort of long period of evolution. And a few high status burials, including this one of an individual buried with a lead seal or bulla. So he may have been carrying a papal indulgence to guarantee that prayers were said for him after he died to ease his passage from purgatory into heaven. That's the charnel house. I'm doing this very quickly because I think people might want to hear about Greyfriars. I've got to move on a bit. That's the charnel house. And there's the final phase of St Peter's Church shortly before it was demolished. Now, most of St Peter's Church disappeared into the Free Grammar School, and amazingly, some of the timbers of the roof structure are identifiable as ecclesiastical timbers. So these are the tie beams of St Peter's Church, still present in the Free Grammar School. And these are the adjacent high status buildings on the St Peter's site, which may be a vicarage or possibly the hall and undercroft of a benefactor of the church from the sort of 12th, 13th century, that sort of thing. The mud and framed building is really a masterpiece of excavation by Tony Nanaratnam, who did the work there. Most people would look at it and think it was just sort of smears of different coloured soil, but he managed to work out that you were looking at the sort of kitchen range of a mud and timber building that was then attached to a major timber hall on the western side. The School of Archaeology and Ancient History did 10 seasons of excavation at Leicester Abbey. This is a site that was excavated back in the 20s, mainly to make it into a public park because it could have been donated to the city by the Earls of Dysart. But it wasn't excavated to any sort of modern standard. It was really sort of stripped bare and the plan was drawn. But we've done a bit of work to try and work out the plan of the gatehouse of the Abbey, which now lies under what's Cavendish House, a 17th century mansion. And we've revealed the plan of the gatehouse in its final phase here with an adjacent kitchen, which may have been the abbot's lodging, perhaps in the 15th century, shortly before the Abbey was dissolved in 1538. But it holds up very much against Thornton Abbey on the Humber, so very similar sort of plan of gatehouse. We've also done some forays down in this area. This is the sort of 1930s plan, but down here looking at the kitchen, and also learnt quite a bit more about the guest range and also the infirmary up here. And no, we haven't looked in the Lady Chapel where Cardinal Wolsey is. But what's remarkable about Leicester Abbey is, again, the walls are mostly robbed, but occasionally we do see some good survival of tile floors, including this one in the eastern cloister walk, and also parts of the chapter house, which little did we know it at the time. This was in many ways a sort of a bit of a training ground for what was to come in August of this year. Also remains of the kitchen with some good exterior paving, the remains of drains and things with water being channeled through the middle of the kitchen so people could wash fish and other things. And we're seeing fish scales washed into the drains, and the environmentalists are picking those up and learning more about the species that were consumed as well. So here's the kitchen. The top illustration shows the Leicester Abbey kitchen, a great square building, 39 feet square internally, and again very similar to an example at Glastonbury Abbey, another very high status abbey, where they're almost identical in terms of scale, and both have these corner ovens making an octagonal interior and a square exterior. And that's the reconstruction of Leicester Abbey that was done by John Finney, showing the layout of some of these buildings like the kitchen and these other ranges that we've recently excavated, plus the gatehouse. And what's great about this really is that not only have we learnt more about the Abbey, we've been able to produce an academic publication, but also working very closely with the City Parks Department, we've now put a trail of display boards so people can actually guide themselves around the site. So it's a real sort of benefit to the community. The city's also recently restored the laid out walls of the Abbey And an effect of this has been that archaeologists have had the opportunity to watch the work being done and have recovered quite a lot of architectural fragments, such as these column capitals laid out on this wall, which have again sort of told us a lot more about how the cloisters in particular looked in the 12th and 13th centuries. And we also had bits of sort of modern evidence coming up as well. So a nice little bottle with a note in it from the gents who laid the stones of the wall in 1934. So things like that turn up from time to time. Well, that was a fairly sort of rapid whiz through the story of Leicester with using archaeology, using those case studies. But I hope it's given you a sort of feel of the sort of breadth of evidence that we can draw upon to try and tell this story. Now, I wouldn't probably get out of here alive if I didn't say something about Richard III, so I'll say it very quickly. This was a sort of a project which we were approached to do about 2 years ago, and which I didn't have any great high hopes of, I have to say. As I said before, looking for a named individual isn't really a very good idea in archaeological terms, because you're almost setting yourself up to fail. But we decided it was going to be a very interesting project, and we would learn more about the Greyfriars, and it's an area of the city that we've not had much chance to investigate. And I did say I'd eat my hat if we found him, a cake version, luckily. So we went into the project looking, we did all the sort of desk-based assessment first, and we could reveal precisely where, on this 1741 map of Leicester, where the Greyfriars precinct lies. But we didn't really know whereabouts within the precinct the church and the other friary buildings were. So we decided to do 2 trenches through the middle of the precinct. The first one ran north-south. You can see St Martin's Cathedral in the background, so it ran sort of down here. And this one immediately revealed a series of cross walls running east-west, which is what we'd hoped to do, which were part of a major building. But it was then difficult at that stage to know what sort of building it was. We did another trench next to it, which revealed a pair of walls running parallel, about 2.5 metres apart, and with evidence of tiled floor between them, which suggested it was a corridor or an alley. I'm afraid it's not a very photogenic site, but you can just about see an area of tiled floor there, a step, and then what's left of tiled floor is just the mortar bedding here. Well, it's all mortar bedding, but that's even more poorly preserved. In the other trench, we also saw evidence for a wall running east-west with what seemed to be a stone bench attached to it, an area of flooring here, and eventually another bit of wall down here. So what this seems to be is the eastern cloister walk and the chapter house, because the bench is where you'd sit to have the sort of day's meeting with the guardian of the friary. Sorry, I should mention we've already found bits of window tracery coming up from that end and a bit of frieze here, suggesting it was the high status end of the church. But on the other side of the wall, somebody was digging a burial just there, and at the very moment we'd worked out the choir, they said that they'd found a burial which had trauma to the skull, curvature of the spine, and a projectile between 2 of the vertebrae. So you can imagine what we said. Or what I said, but I'm not going to tell you what it was. So this is the grave that we found, and it seems to be at the very point that you would go into the choir from the middle part of the church, called the walking place, which you'd have access to from the cloister walk. So at the moment we're not saying it's Richard III, but it's a very strong candidate, and there's lots of analysis still to do. So the human osteologist Joe Appleby and the geneticist Turi King will be doing work on their respective disciplines. We're going to do radiocarbon dating, and we're going to do stable isotope analysis with a view to determining more about the sort of environment in which the individual grew up. So that's sort of where we are at the moment with that, and we hope in due course there'll be a more positive announcement. And at that point I really will stop. So thank you.
Richard, thank you very much. I I mean, the applause said it all, but that was truly brilliant. It really was. And, obviously we're grateful to you for the presentation you've given us this evening, but the depth of knowledge and experience that you have of Leicester and its archaeology is unparalleled. And all credit to your team for all you've done, and indeed to those who, I think Mike Codd and John Finney, who have helped actually do some of those very helpful reconstructions, which I think help us ordinary people to understand and to interpret what you've found about the history of our city. It really was tremendous. Now, I'm not going to talk for too long because I think that you wouldn't forgive me if I kept you too long from having an opportunity to ask Richard some questions. But I do just want, on the back of what Richard has said, just to speak briefly. And I want to begin with a quotation. In Leicester, one may wish, I certainly do, for a more articulate sense of civic pride. Now, those are not my words. They're words that were spoken in this university by a professor at this university nearly 40 years ago, one Professor Jack Simmons. It was a lecture he delivered here that in 1974 set me and many others thinking about the history of our city and inspired many of us. And he added, "I think Leicester has cause to feel more proud of its past than it often seems to." Well, I think, if anything has illustrated that point to us this evening, Richard's lecture has done. When I have often spoken of Leicester's collective inferiority complex, I've been aware, as Jack Simmons points out, that it's not a new diagnosis. And in Professor Jack Simmons' many writings, and as Professor of History here at Leicester, he was inspirational in opening up, exploring, and enthusing about the story of Leicester. And I think Richard's lecture tonight is in that excellent tradition of this university of studying, of understanding, of caring, and of valuing its city, and also of seeking enthusiastically to share that understanding with the city itself. Now, I have to say that unfortunately, the value of Leicester's history and pride in its past and care for its historic built environment has not always, certainly over the last century, been shared by the decision makers. In 1960, the great chronicler of English architectural history, Sir Nicholas Pevsner, wrote, "The group of the Castle, St. Mary, the Newark, St. Nicholas, the Roman Baths, St. Martin's, and the Guildhall is something the patriotic citizen of Leicester might proudly take any visitor to, British or foreign." In 1960, that group was intact. A decade later, its integrity had been lost. As Professor Simmons put it, the motorist driving through the city from south to north, if he dares take his eye off the road for a moment, sees the steeples of churches and odd museum pieces they look, haphazardly scattered on either side of him. There is nothing to show that he is passing through the heart of one of the oldest large industrial towns in Northern Europe. As Richard has referred to during his lecture, a road and an underpass, and later some monstrous flyovers that were added, carved through the medieval and the Roman heart of the town to make way for the motor car, because that was the modern thing to do. Indeed, when I was first elected to the council in the years of the early 70s, the council was still buying up and allowing to decay the properties in St. Martin's, Soulsby Lane, and Cank Street with a view to demolishing the lot of them to make way for a multi-storey car park. Now, although that brutal vandalism was stopped, and I want to pay tribute particularly this evening to John Dean, who was an inspirational planning officer during that period and will be known to many here. That was stopped. The St Martin's Square that was built on the backland actually behind some of that acquisition was, I think, the single development that represented the turning point in the fortunes of the declining city centre and the care for the environment of the historic legacy that we had inherited. But I do believe that despite that having been stopped, in the intervening years, Leicester has become even more disconnected from its past. Because in the same way as our modern retail core is physically cleaved from the old town and the Newark, I believe that understanding of our past is remote in the present generation. But as Richard has demonstrated to us this evening, the city's past isn't lost to us. The story can be told. The Roman story, the Saxon story, the medieval story, they are all there. But if you ask the modern Leicester resident where their castle is, the best the majority will manage is to suggest that the 19th century prison in Welford Road is the only one they know about. Similarly, if you ask them what the Jury Wall is, few will have a clue, as Richard has reminded us this evening, that it is one of the most significant pieces of Roman masonry in the country. And my predecessors, I believe, have much to answer for. They left the magazine gateway locked up. The Castle Hall that Richard's talked about this evening was stored with junk. Wiggiston's house, the lovely Tudor Merchants' Hall, was closed away and was gathering dust. And I believe that is scandalous. But despite the damage of Vaughan Way and the underpass, all is not lost. Some buildings are gone, and much damage was done. But I do believe that a few hundred metres apart, most of the important buildings do remain and can be reconnected. And I think, as Richard and his team have shown, it is possible to enthuse people and to inform them about the city's history. We have enormous strengths, we have enormous assets in this city. Those buildings are there, they're just carved apart. Now, I've reflected on recent decades. In fact, looking back, it hasn't all been negative. I remember when I came to Leicester, the Crescent that I had the pleasure of walking past this evening on my way over here was virtually abandoned and was decaying. And look at it now. I remember the Eastern Relief Road was due to bring more of those sort of scenes to our city. It was due to carve from the Mayfield Road roundabout, through St James's Road, through Upper Titchbourne Street, some wonderful buildings there, carve all the way through there to connect across to Humberston Road. It didn't happen, and those roads still remain. And we've also had some not inconsiderable victories over the period in saving some of what we now cherish. Although we lost one side of Lower Hastings Street, originally Waterloo Way was to go a dual carriageway through New Walk at ground level. Now it didn't. And that's very much down to somebody here that I don't think many here, if any here, will remember, a guy called Bill Scotton, a councillor, who'll not even be a footnote in the history book, but he made it his mission out at County Hall to make sure it went down and under. And as a result of that, to a significant extent, the integrity of New Walk was maintained. So it hasn't all been negative. And indeed, if you look at New Walk today, it's better cared for today than it has been probably for over a century, if not perhaps since it was laid out in, I think, the 1780s. And what's also interesting to see is how many people are choosing to live in New Walk and elsewhere in the city centre. People are coming back, and not just individual people or couples, families are moving back. And that is enormously encouraging. And indeed, looking at the disconnections that were made, we have had some notable successful reconnections. The magazine gateway, the entrance to the Newark, is now off a traffic island and reconnected to De Montfort University, now standing on the site of the new works in Newark. We can't fill in the trench that is the underpass. And perhaps, as Stuart Bailey and others have suggested, perhaps wouldn't want to, because it might do more damage than it's worth. But we can begin the process of doing some of the reconnections. We can reconnect New Walk to the Newark, down Newark Street. We can reconnect the Guildhall to St Nicholas and to Jury Wall. We can reconnect the High Cross to its original location. We can reconnect the High Street to the Castle and to St Mary de Castro. And we can bring the Belgrave Road flyover back to build Belgrave Road back to the city centre as well at the same time. I believe that we have opportunities in this generation to reconnect some of that damage that was done over the last, and the middle part particularly, of the last century. I believe that we can, metaphorically at least, create yellow brick roads. There is surplus carriageway around the Newark, around St Nicholas Circle, largely as a result of the pedestrianisation in the city centre. We can reclaim that, and we can re-establish those links. Now, I'm not saying we can, as yet, pull down the Holiday Inn, as yet, but we can at least, surely, enable pedestrians to get from Jury Wall on one side of it to the castle on the other side of it without risking their lives. And I have tried it. I don't recommend it for those who are not fleet of foot. And I do believe later we can look beyond some of the connections across the Old Town and also look to some of the connections just a few hundred metres beyond the city centre to some of the other gems of previous generations. And Richard obviously has talked about the Abbey, but Abbey Park, that wonderful Victorian park that's set out there, is an absolute gem. It's a few hundred metres from the city centre, and you can't find it. Unless you actually know that by walking past St Margaret's Church and round the corner you'll get there very quickly, you won't do it. So I believe there are other opportunities for reconnection after we've done the connection between the modern retail heart and the historic Old Town. I'm not sure whether we can actually reconstruct the Blue Boar. But what Richard has shown, and what his team have shown with him, is that all is not lost. Richard, and I believe it is him, is not lost even after 500 years. And I think that we have opportunities, and we have now, I believe, the opportunity, particularly because of the discoveries Richard's made and the excitement that has generated, to bring the public mood with us, to re-establish those connections and to re-establish the story. Because I think the challenge now is to reconnect Leicester with its rich history and to tell its story as part of doing that, and at the same time to reconnect the modern city with its historic form. If Leicester is truly to be the proud and self-confident city it deserves to be, this reconnection can and must be done. I return to the words of Jack Symonds. I think Leicester has cause to feel more proud of its past than it often seems to. And I think the challenge to us is to make sure that it knows about that past and is proud of it. Thank you very much.